and these ideas of faith and freedom felt antagonistic. It was like you could have one or the other, but you couldn't have both. That in order to align with that version of faith, you had to be willing to sacrifice some freedom. Or in order to experience the freedom that you really wanted, you had to walk away from or ignore or sacrifice or give up some aspect or some part or maybe even your faith completely. And so what we've been talking about through this conversation, if you're just coming in, if this is your first time here, you're on the tail end of a conversation that's been going on for 6 weeks, and we'll catch you up. Don't worry, it'll all make sense to you. But at the same time, we'd encourage you to go back and watch the previous 5 weeks, which you can find on YouTube by searching for Key City Church and find the previous 5 messages there so that all of this can make a little bit more sense. But just to get you caught up, what we've established so far, so we've established, number one, that we were meant to be free. You were, I was, we were meant to be free. And we know this. We know this. We are at our best when we are functioning freely. And we also recognized that the things that we do, not everything that we do is free. The choices that we make, the behaviors, the habits, the things that we engage in, the things that we find ourselves doing, it's not always free. That what we do functions on a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum is freedom. On one end of the spectrum are the things that we do freely because they align with our values, our desires, the things that are important to us, our priorities. We choose them freely. And on the other end of the spectrum are the things that we do by control. That everything that we do falls on the spectrum of either freedom or control or some mix. To the extent that it's not free, it's by control. And control is essentially getting someone to do what they wouldn't freely choose. That if you can come up with the right threat, the right punishment, or a good enough reward, you can override someone's freedom. And what we've recognized is that control works great, but control always comes with a cost. And for a lot of us, the version of faith that we were handed, the version of faith that we inherited, so often was a version of faith that was a control-based version of faith. That believed in a control-based God, a God who made rules, things that you had to believe and ways that you had to behave. And there are things that nobody would freely choose to do on their own. So God instituted punishments and rewards to get people to do what they wouldn't freely choose. And on top of that, God said, and my acceptance and my approval of you is contingent on you believing and behaving the way that I want you to. That if you believe and behave the way I tell you to, then I'll be happy with you. But if you don't, then I won't. And so often in a control-based version of faith that believes in a control-based God, you often find a control-based community that says you can belong here as long as you're willing to believe and behave the way that we want you to. And if you do, we'll be happy with you. But if you don't, then we won't. And if that's the version of faith that you were introduced to, chances are you either resisted it. That's why you didn't want to have anything to do with anything resembling faith or spirituality or religion to begin with, or you resigned yourself to that control. And that resignation eventually may have led to resentment, and eventually that resignation may have led to the sense of disintegration, where you felt like you weren't just losing your freedom, but you were losing a part of yourself. And eventually, you walked out, you walked away. And what we've discovered through this series is that control-based version of faith was the version of faith that Jesus was inviting his first century followers out of. That God, the God who created us in his image, the God who created us to be like him, and watched as we lost sight of what he was like, and watched as we became very unlike him, that God became like us in the person of Jesus. And he became like us to show us what he's actually like. That when we see what God is actually like in the person of Jesus, we realize that we actually like him. And that as Jesus' eyewitnesses and his first century followers concluded that if God is like Jesus, then God is love. self-sacrificial, unconditional love. And not only had God in Jesus come to show us exactly what he's like, but he invited us to follow him. Not to follow rules, not to follow rituals, not to follow a religion, but to follow him, to live in alignment with his way of love, that we would become like him, that we would learn to love with the same kind of unconditional, self-sacrificial love. And his invitation to align with him was ultimately an invitation to align with reality. Because it's the way that we were created to live. It's the way that life was meant to work. One another, your neighbor as yourself, love is the design principle of life. It's who we were meant to be. It's the only way life can work. And it's what Jesus was inviting us to align with, to follow him. And what we found out was that if you're trying to get someone to follow rules, if you're trying to get someone to follow a religion, control works really well. You can get people to do a lot of crazy stuff through control. But if you're trying to get someone to follow you in relationship, control doesn't work. The currency in relationship, and we know this, you know this, the currency in a relationship is what? It's trust. It's trust. And for trust to be trust, it has to be free. You can't force, you can't threaten, you can't manipulate, you can't coerce, you can't bribe trust. Control always undermines and destroys trust. For trust to be trust, it has to be free because you're convinced of the person's intentions. You're convinced of their goodness. And that this is exactly what God had come to do in the person of Jesus. It's what the cross was all about. It was God coming to show us that if he's willing to die for us, then he is for us. And that he will never violate, he will never threaten our freedom, so that we would trust him fully. That when we trust him fully, invite us to trust him freely, fully and freely, that we would be set free. That when we trust Jesus freely, it sets us free into who we were meant to be, who you were meant to be. The version of yourself that leverages your best for the best of others. Love one another, your neighbor as yourself kind of love. It's who we were meant to be. That Jesus came not to constrain us into something that we're not. He came that we would trust him and that it would free us in to who we were always meant to be. And then our conversation took a turn and we started asking the question, well, what does that look like and what does that take to be freed into who we were meant to be? What does it look like to trust Jesus freely and be set free into who we were meant to be? And we identified three things that we see repeated over and over in Jesus' teachings and the teachings of his eyewitnesses and first century followers, and that we hear over and over in the experiences of those who trust Jesus and follow him fully. These three things that we're always going to come back to all the time as a church, like everything's going to point back to these three things. These are the three things that we cultivate to release to free that version of ourselves, that potential that God has planted in us. And the first one is Christ-centered worldview, which is just a fancy way of saying that when we see as Jesus sees, loving like Jesus just comes naturally. That when we see God the way that Jesus sees God, when we see eternity the way that Jesus sees eternity, when we see ourselves, when we see others the way that Jesus does, then loving other people self-sacrificially just comes naturally. The second one was holistic personal disciplines. And it was just recognizing that the things that we do consistently will shape us eventually. That what we do habitually, what we do as patterns, the decisions that we make every day, the routines that we get in, the things that we do consistently will shape us eventually. And that freeing our God-given potential requires us to recognize those habits, those patterns, those routines that are constraining us, that might be mastering us and getting a hold of us and constraining that potential. and simultaneously developing the habits, the patterns, and the routines as we follow Jesus and learn from him and model our life after him, that the things that we do consistently will shape us eventually. And then lastly, last week we talked about authentic community. That when we surround ourselves with people who are moving in the same direction, it keeps us going in that same direction. When we surround ourselves with authentic community, a community where we are fully accepted as we are, we authentically get better. Right? When we surround ourselves with people who keep the pretenses, you know what we get better at? We get better at pretending. Because it's what they expect. There's a pretend version of ourselves that they expect us to be. And we get really good at pretending. But when we have an authentic community that accepts us just as we are, we get authentically better. Now, this is our last Sunday of the series. And some of you might be wondering, like, how can we still have another week of talking about freedom? Like, this has been enough already. But it's not, because this week, this Sunday, we had to end it here. We had to end it here because this Sunday is like putting a great big warning label on the whole series, just slapping a warning on the side of it. Because Paul, who was a follower of Jesus, and we'll talk about Paul in a second, Paul put a huge warning on this. And we're going to be looking a lot at the words of Paul. Because here's what happens. What happens is, it is so easy. It is so easy to take these things, or things like this, or whatever your things are. If your things are not these 3 things, or you have 5 things, or 6 things, but to take things like this, we'll just say these 3 things for now, to take this, and to turn this from what sets us free into what makes God happy. It is so easy. Our tendency, our drift as followers of Jesus is always going to be back towards taking these 3 things that set us free, taking the things that set us free, and turning them into the things that make God happy. From the things that God wants for us to the things that God is demanding from us. That is always going to be the tendency of followers of Jesus. It's always going to be the tendency of communities that are following Jesus. And the reason is because freedom and grace and acceptance feels really, really vulnerable. We feel really vulnerable and really insecure when we can't point to something and say, that's why God loves me, because of that. When we don't have that and we just have to rely on God's complete, absolute grace, that's a little nervous. And our tendency then is to want to point to something and say, well, you know, God accepts me because of that. Because of that. This is why God accepts me. This is why God approves of me. And we find ourselves reverting back to this control-based version of faith. It's so easy for our response to mistakes and missteps, whether they're our mistakes or somebody else's mistakes. It's so easy to revert back to just a little bit of shame, a little bit of guilt, a little bit of disappointment, a little bit of, oh, I can't believe you did that. Oh, you're making that choice? Oh, that's what you're going to, just a little bit of shame, mix it in to pull ourselves back in line, to pull other people back in line. It's so easy to fall back into that. It's so easy for a well-meaning, well-intending faith community to slip back into and to revert back to a control-based version of faith by just adding in, just takes a little bit of shame, just a little bit of guilt, just a little bit of fear, just a little bit of threat of punishment to pull ourselves back in line, to pull others back in line, and the whole thing starts to unravel. And the tendency is always going to be to drift back to a control-based version of faith. And so the warning comes from a follower of Jesus named Paul, because this tendency that is always going to pull us back, this tendency isn't new to us. This tendency was there 2,000 years ago. And Paul, who was a proponent of the control-based version of faith when Jesus walked on the pages of history, control-based version of Judaism. Paul was actually a legalistic Pharisee, which was like the most controlling, most legalistic, most rule-oriented type of Jew. And Paul was actually putting followers of Jesus in prison until he met the resurrected Jesus. And once you meet the resurrected Jesus, the tendency is to become a follower of Jesus. And he became a follower of Jesus and started planting communities of followers of Jesus around the Mediterranean. And one of these was in a city called Galatia. So Paul had gone to a group of Jews in Galatia, Jews who'd been following the Old Testament law. The Old Testament law consisted of 600 plus laws that God had given to his people through Moses, which was meant to govern them as a nation. And those things went from the things that we have to do in order for us to be happy to the things that we have to do in order to make God happy. Paul went to them and said, guess what? God has shown up in the person of Jesus, and he's inviting you out of that. He came to set you free. He wants something better for you. And so they became followers of Jesus. And Paul said, great. He raised up some leaders, and Paul moved on to go do some other things. And after Paul moved on, a group of people came into Galatia, to these young, immature followers of Jesus. Some new teachers came in called Judaizers. And the Judaizers said, you can't just be a follower of Jesus. In order to be a follower of Jesus, you also have to follow the Old Testament law. And these young, immature, impressionable followers of Jesus, it was so easy for them to drift back to that control-based version of faith, that control-based, rule-governed, fear-driven version of faith. Their consciences had been so shaped by the law that it was so easy to make them feel guilty, experiencing the freedom and the grace that Jesus offered. It was so easy for them to drift back and get pulled back into that control-based version of faith. And Paul hears about it. Paul, from a distance, finds out that this community that had been experiencing the grace and freedom of Jesus was going back to this control-based version of faith. So Paul writes them a letter. And we're going to spend a lot of time looking at this letter tonight because this letter that Paul writes is so critical and so important. And the reason I want you to understand this is because I don't want anybody to think that I'm making up like this whole freedom thing. Paul was borderline insane in driving home the importance of freedom. And in fact, as we read along in this letter, Paul gets irate. Irate to the point of like PG-13, maybe R, maybe 80s PG. I don't know. We'll see when we get there. But so Paul's writing to them, and he's warning them about falling back. And he's telling them, he's like, look, I'm not saying that the law was bad. He's saying, I'm not saying it was bad. It was just temporary. It was like a guardian. It was fine for a time because it kept you in line, but it was only meant to be for a time. And he's trying to make this make sense to them. So here's what he says. He says, listen, what I'm saying is that as long as an heir, someone who's inheriting something, as long as an heir is underage, he's no different from a slave, although he owns the whole estate. As long as the heir is a child, you don't give them the inheritance. You don't give them the $1 million. You don't give them the family farm. They're just a child. And when a child's a child, control makes sense. Control makes sense for children, right? Children need some rules, and they need some punishments and rewards if they follow the rules. Children need brush your teeth or no dessert tomorrow. Children need share your blocks or you're going to have time out from your blocks. Like, that makes sense. That's appropriate for a child. But you don't give a child the estate. You don't give the child the family business. And Paul's telling him, he's like, this was you. Like 2,300, 1,300 years ago, 1,300 years ago when God gave the law through Moses to you, you were like that child as a nation. Like your moral compass, it was off. Like, it was really off. Like, we don't have to go. You know this. It was off. You needed some controls. You needed some rewards and some consequences. It made sense at the time because you were like a child, like an immature nation. And so the heir is subject to guardians and trustees. When you're a child, you're subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. Paul's saying the law was fine for a time because it kept you in line, but there was an until. There was an until when the guardian when this babysitter who was taking care of you, there was a time when the babysitter wouldn't be necessary anymore. The babysitter was there for a time, but there's going to be a time when the babysitter goes away and you're going to be expected to grow up. And so Paul says, and so also when we were underage, when we were just children as a nation and our moral compass was all distorted, we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. We were subject to these elementary, immature, childish, hand-holding, babysitter version of faith. Like when we were young and immature, the version of faith that was appropriate for us was a babysitter version of faith. My kids love when I say this. And there's a big but now. There's a big but on the other side of this. And the big but is this. But when the set time had fully come, Paul's saying, the until has come. When the set time had fully come, when the time was just right, when everything was in place and everything was perfect, God sent his son. God came in the person of Jesus, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. That God came in the person of Jesus to redeem us, to rescue, to free us from the control-based version of faith, that we would become no longer children needing a babysitter, but that we would become full-blown, full-grown sons and daughters. Because you are his sons, God sent his Spirit, the Spirit of his Son, into our hearts, the Spirit who calls, Abba, Father. That God had come and was establishing a brand new kind of relationship with us. Not a babysitter kind of relationship. Not a policeman in the sky relationship. Not a divine judge relationship. That God had come that we would know him intimately as Father. What would you have to do to make a good father turn away from you? What would you have to do to make a good father stop loving you? What are the beliefs? What are the behaviors that you could ever engage in? What could you ever do to make a good father turn his back and walk away from you? Nothing. Nothing. That's the point. God, in the person of Jesus, was creating a brand new relationship, not a babysitter relationship, but a relationship of grace and freedom. And so, Paul says, so you're no longer a slave. You're no longer meant to stay in that babysitter version of faith, but you are God's child. And since you are his child, God's also made you an heir. Paul's saying, look. Dad came back, and he paid the babysitter, and he sent her home, okay? And now you are expected to be a full-blown, full-grown son and daughter, because now God's giving you the inheritance. It's time to grow up. And the inheritance was a promise that God had given Abraham 2,300 years before, that God told Abraham, I'm going to bless the entire world through you. And then Jesus showed up, God showed up in the person of Jesus and said, here's what that's going to look like. It's going to look like a kingdom of one another, your neighbor as yourself. Oh, and your enemies too, and those who persecute you. And turn the other cheek and go the extra mile, your best for the best of others kind of love. I am building a kingdom that is going to change this world by how you love one another. This is the kingdom that I am building. And listen to me, babies don't build kingdoms. You don't give babies kingdoms to build. Babies don't build kingdoms. And so it's time to grow up because we can't grow and control. You can't grow. You don't grow and control. Control has an expiration date. There's a point when control doesn't work anymore. And those of you who are parents, you know this. And if you've been parented, you know this. So that's all of us. We all know this. Right? you don't parent a 13-year-old the same way you parent a 3-year-old, right? And if you do, good luck with that, right? My daughter just turned 13 on Wednesday. And I would, I have to be careful, she's here. She said this was okay. I would not parent her now the same way that I parented her when she was 3. She needed a babysitter when I left when she was 3. I would not leave her with a babysitter now. When she's 30, even less so. Like if she needs a babysitter when she's 30, something's gone really wrong. You don't parent your children the same way when they're 13 and when they're 30 as when they were 3. Control has to go away. If you try to parent your 13-year-old by control, by the same punishments and rewards that you used when they were 3, you are going to get rebellion, right? Because we're meant to be free. They're growing up. They're learning. They're discovering. You can't have that same kind of control and not get rebellion. And if you don't get rebellion, you know what you get? You get a dependent child who never learns how to move out and to step out and live and be and function independently and autonomously. And you don't give the family business to a child that is still dependent. You don't entrust the family business to a child who's always looking over their shoulder and saying, is this okay, Dad? Should I do it like this? Are you going to get mad at me if I do it like this? Should I do it like this or this, Dad? You don't entrust the family business to a child who's always asking, Dad, how do I do this? And tell me exactly how I do this, right? Because they're not ready for it. We can't grow in control. What we need is freedom to grow. There's a point where in order to continue to grow and develop and mature, we have to be free. That if you are going to entrust the family business to a full-grown, full-blown son or daughter, you expect that you've passed on your way of seeing things to them, your values, your principles. Here's how we run the business. Here's what's important to us. Here are our priorities. Now you go. Now you go build the family business. Now you go expand the family business. I want to see what this looks like when you do it. When you do it. I'm not giving you the instructions for everything to do every step of the way. We're not building IKEA furniture. We're building a kingdom, right? We're building a kingdom. Jesus came and said, grace, grace. Everybody's welcome. Everybody's welcome. Now, I'm inviting you to trust me and follow me freely. And I'm going to show you how to see how I see. And as you follow me, I'm going to teach you to live as I lived. I'm going to put you in community with people that are going to walk with you and be walking in the same direction as you and be encouraging you all along the way. And I want to see the way that love happens through you. I want to see the way that you build the kingdom. I made you to be you. There are things in you. There are things in you that if you try to just mimic or follow the rules, they're not going to come out of you. I want to see what love looks like expressed through you. And that doesn't happen unless we're free. And so Paul says, this is for freedom. This is for freedom that Christ has set us free. You know why Christ set us free? So we'd be free, right? This kind of goes around in a circle, but that's his whole point. Like the whole idea, Paul is saying, is freedom. And so stand firm. And do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Paul's saying, listen, the tendency is always going to drift back to control. It's always going to be to drift back to legalistic rules. And if you don't, then God won't. But if you do, then he will. It's always going to be to drift back to that. Paul's saying, but stand firm. There's always going to be this pull. You've got to resist it. Paul wouldn't say it if it wasn't a temptation. Paul says, you have to resist this because otherwise it destroys the whole thing. Listen, he says, mark my words. Like, mark them. Like, get out your highlighter and your pen and circle this 100 times. Mark my words. I tell you, Paul, am telling you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, cue the record screeching to a halt. Okay, so circumcised. The reason this is suddenly in here is because Circumcision for God's Old Testament people, his nation Israel, was the physical sign that someone was living in obedience with God's Old Testament law. It was the physical sign of their alignment with the law. So circumcision as like that signifier, that mark of alignment with God's law, just became kind of like a shorthand way of referring to alignment with control-based faith, that control-based, rule-governed, fear-driven faith. So Paul's saying, I'm telling you, if you let yourselves fall back into that control-based faith, Christ will be of no value to you. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised, to everyone who falls back into that control-based, rule-governed, fear-driven version of faith, that he's obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. If there is something that you are pointing to explain why God is happy with you, then by definition, your acceptance is no longer unconditional. It is by definition conditional. If you are pointing to something to say, this is why God's happy with me, then you are going to live to be that thing. And eventually, you're going to find yourself in control. And that control is going to come with a cost. Eventually, you're going to find that you resent it. You're going to find that it produces fear, that it undermines trust, because you're destroying grace. That Jesus came to offer grace freely. Jesus said, my door it's wide open. There's nothing you have to do. There's no way you have to behave. There's no way you have to believe. I'm inviting you freely to trust me and to follow me. And only when his grace is completely free can we completely trust him freely. Otherwise, trust isn't trust. And the transformation doesn't happen. That if we make God's acceptance of us conditional, grace loses its effect. We've fallen away from grace. And so Paul says, for through the Spirit, which Paul often called the Spirit of freedom, the Spirit of grace, through the Spirit we eagerly await by faith the righteousness for which we hope. Paul's saying, through freedom, through grace, we are eagerly expecting the transformation that Jesus promised. We've seen what control does. We've seen what control leads to. We see the fear and the conformity that happens from control. But we are convinced that through God's Spirit of freedom and grace, we expect that we're going to transform into people who love like Jesus. He says, for in Christ Jesus, neither following the rules, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision, neither following the rules or not following the rules has any value. It's like it's all grace. In fact, in another letter that Paul wrote, he said, we are saved. We are saved. We are freed into and transformed into people who experience, engage in our lives the way that God does. We are saved by grace through, and some of you know this, through what? Through faith. Another word for faith is trust. We are saved, we are transformed through grace, by trust. It is grace that frees us to trust God and leads us to transformation. It has to be free. When you take away the freedom, you lose the possibility for transformation. We're transformed by grace through faith. It all starts. You have to see where the root grows. It grows from grace, transformed by grace through the trust that we are allowed to have through grace. It all starts with grace. And if we're transformed by grace, then we shouldn't be stingy with it. We shouldn't hold it back. If we're transformed, if we're saved by grace, then we should drink it foolproof, uncut, undiluted. We should pour it out and not hold it back. So Paul's saying, do not trade grace in for anything else. Don't cut it, don't dilute it, drink it full straight, because neither following the rules or not following the rules has any value. It's meaningless. The only thing that counts, the only thing that counts. Paul, can you really say only thing? I mean, there are a lot of things in the Bible. It's a pretty thick book. Paul's like, no, listen. The only thing out of all the things, the only thing that counts. That's a big thing to say. The only thing that counts? Paul, come on. Paul says the only thing that counts is faith or trust expressing itself through love. It's the only thing that counts. Not how you believe, not how you behave. It is the trust that comes from absolute grace that works its way out in love. And for trust to be trust, it has to be free. And so in order to love fully, in order to grow into someone who leverages your best for the best of others, your unique best, leveraging your background, your experiences, your personality, everything that makes you, leveraging your best for the best of others, to love fully, we have to be free. We have to be free. It's grace that produces trust, that frees us to follow Jesus fully. In order to love fully, we have to be free. And so then Paul goes on. I mean, we could stop this and pray it out and wrap it up, and you guys could go home. But you've got to hear how serious Paul gets about this. Like, Paul gets a little bit crazy, because he now turns his attention from the community of followers of Jesus, and he focuses his attention on the people who've come along and taught them all this stuff. And he gets irate. Listen. He says, you guys were running a good race. Who cut in on you to keep you from obeying the truth? It's like what they're teaching, it's not true. Reversion to control-based faith, it's not true. Rules, what you have to believe, what you have to behave so that God can be happy with you, that's not truth. That kind of persuasion doesn't come from the one who calls you. That is not from Jesus. That pulling you back into control-based, rule-governed, fear-driven faith, that's not from Jesus. A little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. Let that sink in. A little bit of control, a little bit of shame, a little bit of guilt, a little bit of threat, a little bit of fear. It works through the whole batch of dough. It only takes a little bit to ruin the whole thing. Freedom is so fragile. You guys know this. Freedom is so fragile. It only takes a little bit of shame, a little bit of, oh, I can't believe you. Just a little bit of, oh, I thought better of you. Just a little bit of, oh, what do you think God thinks of that? Just a little bit of shame and guilt and fear, and you ruin it. It only takes a little bit to ruin the freedom. We can only grow in freedom. It only takes a little bit. Works through the whole batch of dough. Here's what Paul says next. He says, I'm confident in the Lord that you will take no other view, that you're not going to go back to that control-based version of faith, that the one who is throwing you into confusion, whoever that may be, will have to pay the penalty. Brothers and sisters, listen, if I'm still preaching circumcision, if I'm still teaching about control-based faith, why am I still being persecuted? It's like the whole reason I'm being persecuted is because I won't back down from freedom and grace. In that case, the offense of the cross has been abolished. The offense of the cross was not control. The offense of the cross was not who God was keeping out. The offense of the cross was grace and who God was letting in. Paul's saying, if I'm teaching control-based faith, I've completely abolished the whole point of Jesus' death on the cross. And hold on, don't go there yet. Warning, like, if you have kids in here, this is where Paul just gets a little bit crazy. This is like that moment in the 80s PG movie where you didn't remember that part, and then you're watching it with your kids, and you're like, oh, they just said that. Like, they just said that, and my kids heard that, and now that's in their head. Like, Paul goes 80s PG on us here. And the point is, because this is how serious this is. And this is how serious it was. Not how serious I'm making it. This is how serious it was to Paul, because Paul understood this is how serious it is to Jesus. He didn't back down from it. He's like, this is so important. Listen. As for those agitators, those people who are trying to pull you back to that control-based version of faith, who are telling you that you need to be circumcised for God to be happy with you, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. This is the importance of grace and freedom, that anybody who would shame you or guilt you or frighten you back into control-based versions of faith, I wish they'd just go the whole way and cut it off. This is how important it was to Paul. He did not back down. So toxic, he saw this. He saw it as so dangerous and having the potential to undermine everything that Jesus had come to do. He was livid. My man was livid. He's like, we are not going to tolerate this insertion of control-based faith. Jesus has come to set you free. He's inviting you in to trust him freely. And that freedom, that grace, that's what produces trust. And it's the trust that transforms you. And just takes a little bit of control, a little bit of shame, a little bit of doubt, a little bit of you better, and if you didn't, then God won't. And can you imagine what he's going to think of? Only a little bit of that. And it destroys the whole thing. So Paul says, he says, you, my brothers and sisters, you were called to be free. But don't use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Don't use your freedom to walk out of alignment with Jesus' way of love. I mean, you're free to. As a follower of Jesus, you're free to walk on the path behind Jesus or walk off the path. You're free. He's like, but don't do it. Because when you walk out of alignment with Jesus' way of love, you just become enslaved to all this other stuff that holds you back from who you were meant to be, from experiencing and engaging in your life the way that you were meant to. So don't do it. Don't use your freedom to do that. Instead, serve one another humbly in love. Like, don't walk out of alignment. No. He set you free to follow him in his way of love. And Paul says it's because of this. Because the entire law, remember those 600 plus commands? The entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command. Geez, Paul, here you go again with like trying to narrow things down into like a one thing. Like, are you sure you have like the authority to do this? Paul's like, yeah, one command. Are you sure? There are like 600. Paul's like, no, one command. The 10 seemed really important. Paul, no, one. Two commands? Like the second one could be like keep all the other commands? Paul's like, no, one command. We're boiling this all down, the whole thing. Remember how thick the Bible is? We're boiling the whole thing down to one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. That is the whole deal. That is the whole everything. That what Jesus is inviting us into, that Jesus had taken the standard that we felt we had to live up to, that we felt we could never keep up with, that we felt we could never arrive at, that just created a rift between us and God and led us into this fear-driven version of faith where God never seemed happy with us. Jesus had taken that standard and set it on the floor and said, you're good. Come on. It's safe now. Anybody and everybody is welcome to come and follow me freely. And as you follow me, as you trust me in my way of love, I'm going to transform you into someone who loves just like me. And together, we are going to build a kingdom. We're going to change the world. Listen. When we are most free, we love most fully. A little bit of control undermines the whole thing. It undoes the whole thing. Our tendency, your tendency, is always going to be to drift towards a little bit of shame, a little bit of guilt, a little bit of rule keeping. It's always going to be to drift that way. But your best to love the way that Jesus has loved us is found when you are fully free. Listen, the people who followed Jesus 2,000 years ago, when Jesus walked onto the pages of history, the people that followed him were people that believed all kinds of stuff. Their theology was all over the place. There are people whose behavior was all over the place. There were people who felt left out by the whole religious establishment. They'd been hurt by the religious authorities. They'd been separated from God by the rules that they were told that they had to live up to. There were people who made all kinds of mistakes with their lives and had arrived at places thinking like, how could I have gotten here? There were the people who followed Jesus were people who chased after everything that life had to offer and realized that none of it had the answers they were looking for. There were people who'd arrived at the top and felt empty. There were people who'd arrived at dead ends, realizing that the way that they were going wasn't going to work. But they saw in Jesus someone that they thought was different, someone that they might be able to trust. And that they saw in Jesus, it just put into them just a little bit of hope that maybe God really could be as good as Jesus said he was. They weren't sure. Maybe. You know what they did? They followed him. With all of their doubts, with all of their crazy beliefs, with all of their mixed up theology and uncertainty, with all of their habits, with all of their baggage, with all of the stuff from their entire however many years of life, they followed Jesus with all of it. With just a little bit of curiosity and a little bit of hope. And maybe that's you. And maybe you're in a season right now where you're on the fence about this whole faith, this whole religion, this whole church, this whole Jesus stuff. I get it. But if that's you, and you're just a little bit on the fence, you're just a little bit back and forth, you're wondering, is it really safe to go back into this again? I want to encourage you that Jesus is inviting you with your doubts, with your questions, with your uncertainty, with your habits, with your choices, with your past, with your mistakes. He's inviting you to trust him and follow him. And all that means is that you're just going to start following him, that you're going to start reorienting towards a my best for the best of others way of living. That you're going to start taking small steps to figure out, how can I see the way that Jesus sees? What does Jesus really teach? What do I really find in the New Testament when I dig into Jesus' words? What does he really teach? How can I see the way that Jesus sees? And reminding myself every day of how Jesus sees. Of starting to recognize, what are the habits in my life that are undermining my best for the best of others? And what steps do I need to take to start getting rid of those things that have enslaved me and are holding me back from my best? And what are the habits that I need to start putting into my life? Just little things that I know, that we already need to know, that if we just start doing this thing, it's going to move us so much further forward towards our best for the best of others. What are the little habits I just need to start building into my life? Who are the people that I need to start surrounding myself with? You in the next year are going to become like your 5 closest friends? Are you surrounding yourself with the people that you want to become like? Following Jesus means I'm learning to see as he sees. I'm starting to form the habits that he demonstrated. And I'm surrounding myself with more people that are moving in the same direction that I'm moving in. This is the soil. This is the soil that we cultivate that allows us to grow. In you is the divine potential to love the way that Jesus loved. In you is the potential to grow into your best for the best of others, your unique best. And that seed, it just needs the right conditions to grow. You can take a seed and you can cajole it, you can yell at it, you can shame it, you can guilt it, and you can threaten it. And that seed is not going to grow. But you put that seed in the right soil, in the right temperature, with the right mixture, you won't be able to stop it from growing. It was meant to grow. Growing is what it does naturally when it's in the right conditions. When we learn to see the way that Jesus sees, when we start cultivating the habits that Jesus is inviting us into, when we surround ourselves with people who are moving in the same direction and accept us authentically, the most natural thing in the world for you to do is to grow into someone who looks and loves like Jesus, someone capable of leveraging your best for the best of the rest of the world. It sets you free. I'm inviting you. Jesus is inviting you to just start to take one step in his direction and start following him. And he promises that he will set you free. The version of faith that he is inviting you into does not cost your freedom. It is a version of faith that is for freedom. Because you were, I was, we were all meant to be free. Will you guys pray with me? Father, I hope that we never cease to be astonished by the love that you have for us. I pray for everyone here that they would come to know the grace and love and acceptance that you have for them, that it would free us to let down our protective defenses that keep us from seeing ourselves accurately, that we would see ourselves, it would be free to see ourselves with all of our shortfalls as well as all of our strengths. But we'd see ourselves in the light of your grace and your love and your acceptance. And it would just move us just a little bit in your direction to recognize that you see us, scars, wounds, and all, and you love us right there. And you have a beautiful and amazing plan for each of us to see your love build your kingdom uniquely through each of our lives. Father, I pray here for everyone, for every single one of us, that we would be encouraged as we follow you, that we would be encouraged as we take that first step towards you, that we would be encouraged as we walk out of here, and inspired just a little bit to draw a little near to you, and that you would set us free. We love you, and we praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.